Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For this week's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the life of Bonnie Lee Bakley. Bonnie was born on the 7th of June 1956 in Morristown, New Jersey, to Edward and Marjorie Bakley. Her father, Edward, was an alcoholic, and both Bonnie and her younger sister, Marjorie, had a poor relationship with both of their parents. When Bonnie was 8 years old, her and Marjorie were sent to live with their grandmother. At the age of 15, Bonnie left school and moved to New York, determined to make her name as a model. She attended the Barbizon School of Modelling, and while she was living in New York, she met a man by the name of Evangelos Paulakis. Evangelos was an illegal immigrant who was desperate to remain in the US. In 1971, Bonnie agreed to marry Evangelos to enable him to remain in the country. In return, Evangelos paid Bonnie an unknown sum of money. Almost immediately after the marriage was legalized, Bonnie ended it and Evangelos was deported. A few years later, in November 1977, by which time Bonnie had returned to live in New Jersey, she married her second husband, Paul Garon. Paul was not only Bonnie's husband, but also her first cousin. The couple had 2 children together, a son named Glenn and a daughter who they called Holly. Their marriage lasted for 5 years before Bonnie and Paul divorced in 1982. Bonnie was ambitious, driven, and craved the lifestyle of a celebrity. She was desperate to become famous, but lacked any real talent. Despite not being a very good singer, she recorded a song under the name of Lee Bonnie. She also attempted to forge a dance career. Both of these attempts at fame were unsuccessful. In order to support herself, she set up a mail-order business selling nude photographs of women, including herself. Additionally, she ran advertisements in magazines where she would take on a number of different identities of women who were looking for male companions. Once she received replies to these advertisements, she would ask these men to give her money, travel expenses, or large gifts. These businesses became quite successful and lucrative, enabling her to buy several houses. However, this still was not enough to fulfill her desire for fame. As time moved on, her cons became more elaborate. She would lure often older men into relationships, take their money and disappear. Bonnie was a professional con artist, using over 50 aliases to create fake personalities in order to extort or steal money from unsuspecting men. During this time, her 2 children were aware of her dubious and illegal business practices. Despite this, they loved their mother very much and maintained great relationships with her. It seems that, despite many illegal lifestyle choices, she was a good mother to these 2 young children. In the early 1980s, she married for a 3rd time to a man by the name of Roger Moon. The marriage lasted less than 3 years and was quickly followed up by a 4th marriage to DeMart C. Besley in 1988. That marriage was annulled almost immediately. Unsurprisingly, Bonnie had several run-ins with the law. She was arrested on multiple occasions for offences such as possession of fraudulent driver's licences, holding fake social security details, and trying to cash bad cheques. She received multiple fines and completed community service, but was not imprisoned for her crimes. With her dreams of becoming famous herself unsuccessful, Bonnie became increasingly obsessed with and determined to marry a celebrity. In the early 1990s, Bonnie decided to move to Memphis, Tennessee. She had set her sights on becoming the girlfriend of Jerry Lee Lewis, the world-famous American singer and pianist. After 2 more short-lived marriages in 1992 to Joseph Brookshire and to William Weber in 1993, both of which were subsequently annulled, she started to follow Jerry Lee Lewis around and managed to befriend his sister. In July 1993, Bonnie gave birth to her third child, a daughter who she named Jerry Lee. Bonnie claimed that the child was the daughter of Jerry Lee Lewis, but a DNA test proved otherwise. It is unclear whether or not Bonnie and Jerry had ever had a physical relationship. His manager at the time claimed that this was not the case, but Bonnie's sister believes that they were romantically involved. After her daughter Jerry's birth, Bonnie left Jerry to be raised by her second husband Paul, who may possibly have been Jerry's biological father. Bonnie then moved to California, where she decided to pursue other celebrities, rumoured to include Dean Martin, Frankie Valli and Gary Busey. Whether or not she ever met or became involved with these men is unclear. In 1994, she married Robert Tellefson, her seventh husband. Once again, the marriage was annulled soon after. In 1995, she married Glynn H. Wolfe, a Baptist minister from Blythe, California. Glynn was famous for holding the record for the largest number of monogamous marriages. Bonnie became his 29th wife and he her 8th husband. This marriage was once again annulled. The following year, in 1996, she married for the 9th time to John Ray. During the 1990s, she had developed an interest in Christian Brando, the son of the American actor Marlon Brando and the actress Anna Kashfi. At that time, Christian was serving a 10-year sentence, having pleaded guilty to the voluntary manslaughter of his sister's boyfriend, who he had shot in the face. Whilst Christian was in prison, Bonnie began writing to him and including nude photographs of herself in the letters. When Christian was released in 1996, Bonnie, who was newly married to John Ray at the time, and Christian became romantically involved. Their relationship continued throughout her marriage to John Ray, which ended in divorce in 1998. In 1999, Bonnie also became involved with the actor Robert Blake after meeting him at a jazz club. Robert, who was 66 at the time, had been an actor since he was a child and was best known for his role in the 1970s TV series Beretta, for which he won an Emmy in 1975. The following year, in June 2000, Bonnie gave birth to her fourth child, a daughter who she named Christian Shannon Brando. Shortly after the birth, Bonnie confided in Robert that she was unsure whether he or Christian was the baby's father. Robert immediately insisted upon a paternity test, and when it was revealed that the baby girl was his, her name was legally changed to Rose Lenore Sophia Blake. Christian Brando, obviously irate at Bonnie's deception and reportedly finding out that the baby wasn't his from the National Enquirer, broke off their relationship. Despite a lack of feelings between Bonnie and Robert, the pair were married in November 2000. Bonnie had finally achieved her dream of marrying a celebrity, but Robert had only married Bonnie as she was the mother of his child. The marriage was unconventional from the start. A prenuptial agreement stipulated that if either spouse ended the marriage, the other would retain custody of Rose. It also stated that Bonnie had to get Robert's permission before any of her family or friends could visit her and Rose. The couple never actually lived together, with Bonnie and Rose residing in a small guest house on Robert's property. It was reported to be an unhappy union, with very little compassion or care between the two. 5 months after their marriage, on 4th of May 2001, Bonnie and Robert went out to dinner at Robert's favourite restaurant, Vitello's in Studio City. Robert was such a regular at the restaurant, there was even a dish named after him on the menu. The couple dined together, seemingly quite relaxed in each other's company, and just before 9:30 p.m. walked out to Robert's car, a 1991 black Dodge Stealth, which was parked around the corner from the restaurant. As they approached the car, Robert realised that he had left something at the restaurant, Bonnie decided to wait in the car while Robert went back to Vitello's. When Robert returned to the car, 44-year-old Bonnie had been shot in the head. Panicking, Robert ran to a nearby house and started banging on the door. The owner, Sean Stanek, answered and found Robert yelling that they needed to call 911. The emergency services arrived shortly afterwards, but Bonnie could not be saved. Robert was in a state of shock. Soon after, it was discovered that the item which he had returned to the restaurant to collect was his gun. An extensive murder investigation followed, with Robert being a suspect from day one. However, with the various scams that Bonnie had been involved in throughout her life, and Christian Brando being furious over the DNA results, the list of suspects was extensive. It was soon established that the gun Robert had been carrying on the night of the murder was not the one used to kill Bonnie. The murder weapon was discovered in a nearby bin. Robert was tested for gunshot residue, and it was also determined that he had not pulled the trigger. When questioned by the police, Robert explained that he had started to carry a gun as Bonnie had become concerned for her own safety. A truck had been seen outside of their house at all hours of the night and day, and when approached was quickly driven away. After over a year of extensive investigation, a press conference was called on the 18th of April 2002. It was announced that Robert was responsible for Bonnie's death and that he was about to be arrested. His arrest, along with that of one of his bodyguards, was televised. Robert was charged with 2 counts of soliciting murder and murder with special circumstances. He was refused bail and put in isolation due to the high-profile nature of his case. Robert was keen to set up a television interview from within the jail, causing 2 of his lawyers, who were completely against the idea, to quit. After he had been in jail awaiting his trial for almost a year, on 26th of February 2003, Robert completed a television interview with ABC's host, Barbara Walters. During this interview, he strenuously denied any involvement whatsoever in Bonnie's death. Meanwhile, Bonnie's sister Marjorie, along with Bonnie's 4 children, the youngest, Rose, being less than 2 years old at the time, filed a wrongful death suit against Robert. This put his defence lawyers in a very difficult position, as for a civil case, Robert could be deposed and called as a witness. Whereas in the criminal case, whether or not Robert would testify would be their decision. The civil case was ultimately delayed, and the preliminary hearing for the criminal case took place in early 2003. It was determined that Robert would stand trial for the murder, and unusually, he was allowed out on $1.5 million bail while awaiting the trial. After falling out with his attorney, Thomas Mesereau, who went on to defend Michael Jackson, Robert hired a little-known lawyer by the name of Gerald Schwartzbach. Gerald completely believed in his client's innocence and was confident of an acquittal when the trial finally got underway in December 2004. If convicted, Robert would face life without the possibility of parole. The prosecution case centred around 2 retired stuntmen, Gary McLarty and Ronald Duffy Hambleton. They both testified that they had been approached by Robert to kill Bonnie. The prosecution showed that Duffy had bought a prepaid phone, and records showed that there were over 30 calls between Robert and Duffy. When both of the stuntmen had refused to kill her, they claimed that Robert had taken matters into his own hands. Bonnie had always had a strange habit of recording every one of her phone calls, and the prosecution produced evidence of Bonnie and Robert arguing. They also questioned why Robert had parked on a dark street away from the restaurant on the night of the murder, if the pair feared that she was being followed. They stated that Robert was obsessed with his daughter and wanted his wife out of the picture. The prosecution also claimed that no one had seen Robert return to the restaurant that evening. The defence presented an entirely different version of events. They argued that the lack of gunshot residue proved that Robert had not pulled the trigger. The defence stated that Robert had indeed contacted Duffy, but this was because he wanted protection and for Duffy to deal with the person who was lurking outside of their house. This was backed up by the other stuntman's son, who testified that his father had been offered $10,000 to rough up the stalker. They further agreed that the booth where Robert and Bonnie had sat that evening was near the entrance to the restaurant, and Robert could easily have returned unseen if the hostess had been away from the front desk at the time. The defence continued by discrediting the two stuntmen by catching them in lies regarding their own drug use. On the 16th of March 2005, Robert was found not guilty of Bonnie's murder. The district attorney publicly labelled the jury incredibly stupid, with many people believing that Robert had got away with murder. However, many who were close to the case held the opposite view, as there simply wasn't anything of any substance which linked Robert to the crime. Just a few months later, Robert was again in court to face the civil suit filed by Bonnie's family. Whilst a criminal case has to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, the threshold in a civil case is considerably lower in that a preponderance of evidence must support the plaintiff's claim. That is, that the plaintiff's argument is more likely to be true than false. Robert did not testify at his criminal trial, but had to at the civil suit. During his testimony, he was argumentative, angry and defensive. At times he would raise his own objections and even went so far as to sustain one of them. The jury deliberated for 8 days before returning the verdict that he was liable for Bonnie's death and awarding damages of $30 million. A subsequent appeal upheld this decision but reduced the damages to $15 million. Despite this ruling, the jury at the civil trial could not agree on the way in which Robert was responsible for his wife's death. Had he pulled the trigger, or had he paid someone to do it for him? The civil case was not without further controversy, as it was reported that some jurors had decided upon his guilt before the trial had even begun. Shortly after the ruling, Robert filed for bankruptcy and hasn't worked as an actor for over 2 decades. Further information from Robert's criminal defence team revealed that during their trial preparation, they had heard from a lady by the name of Diane Madsen. She advised that she had overheard Christian Brando talking to someone by the name of Duffy on the telephone. Christian had previously claimed that he did not know Duffy. Another witness, Brian Allen, came forward stating that he had seen Duffy talking to a man he knew called Mark Jones. Mark was known to have a drug abuse problem, and shortly before Bonnie's murder had been seen by Brian carrying a gun which matched the murder weapon. Other people had also witnessed Mark with this gun. The defence had brought a motion to include this information at trial, but the motion had been denied. The defence believed that Mark Jones shot Bonnie after being hired by Duffy either at the request of or in order to impress Christian Brando. 4 weeks after Bonnie's murder, Mark Jones took his own life. Christian Brando died in 2009 from pneumonia, and Duffy died from natural causes a few years later. Opinion remains divided as to whether or not Robert is guilty of murder. Bonnie's family remain convinced that he killed Bonnie, but Robert maintains his innocence to this day. The murder officially remains unsolved, and with many of the key people involved in these events now dead, it is extremely unlikely that we will ever fully know the truth. Thanks very much for listening to that story. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, please click the subscribe button. Please leave any comments down below. As always, I'll be interested in reading them. And now it's time for petty crime. First up we have Spike, a beautiful 10-pound Chihuahua sent in by Rhonda from Boston. He was a rescue, and Rhonda first owned him from 8 weeks old, and now he is 14 years old. Spike has been found guilty of daily bed invasions. Whilst gently starting on one side of the large queen-size bed, he's known to sneak over to Rhonda's side, and his work is not done until Rhonda is stuck in a small corner. Good work, Spike. Thanks for sending them in, Rhonda. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Brief Cat. Oh yes, this is Briefcase's own cat, Brief Cat. Brief Cat is rather choosy about what he listens to on YouTube. If it's a Briefcase video, sits there all nice as pie. If it's someone else's, this is the typical reaction. Next time Briefcase releases a new video on Briefcase Monday, make sure you tell him you've seen Brief Cat and mention what channel you saw it on. That concludes today's petty crime. Thanks very much for listening to the Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. On Bonnie's IMDb page, she appeared as an extra on Radio Days and Turk 182. Goodbye.